Hi there. This is Stacy Brown Summers coming to you from Mindlink Live. It's been a while since we had a YouTube video, but we're excited today to talk about a topic near and dear to our hearts, which is interpretation. And we are fortunate to have, as part of our team, an experienced interpreter, Sam Espindola. Say hi. There he
Hello,
is.
everyone.
Hey,
Yes.
Sam. And yeah, so we've gotten a lot of questions from clients who are considering incorporating interpreting as part of their strategies, and so we thought it'd be great for Sam to come on and just kind of give us a one-on-one course on the best strategies for working with interpreters and how to get the most out of that relationship. So a couple of housekeeping things. This is a Google Hangout. Some of you might come on live, which is awesome. A lot of you are going to watch this later, which is also awesome. If you're on and you have a question or a comment or want to contribute something, we love that. So just go to the comments and you should just, there's actually a chat feature so you can chat. We'll be monitoring that as we go, and we'll be able to address those questions. If you're not watching this live and you still want to participate, which we again would love, just chat in the comments below, and we can keep the conversation going as long as we want. So that's it. Now, Sam, I am going to give you the floor.
Thank you, Stacy. I appreciate it. Thanks for the warm intro, and thanks everyone for joining us today. As Stacy already mentioned, we are very fond of language access at Mindlink Resources. And I'm going to give a brief presentation of what we do as interpreters. It's something that's near and dear to my heart, especially and I do a lot of interpreting, and I love to share how you as a client can know how to use us effectively for your success. So here it is, Interpreting 101, intro. First of all, I'd like to address, a lot of people say interpreter, translator, they use the term interchangeably, and some say, is it the same or is it different? And it's interesting to note that that interpreters and translators are different, but they do share a lot of similarities. They share similarities in that they work between two languages. Their duty is to transpose ideas from one language to another in a culturally appropriate manner, but they are different in this way. An interpreter is a linguistically skilled individual who communicates culturally accurate spoken ideas from one language to another. So interpreters deal with spoken language versus translators are linguistically skilled individuals who communicate the culturally accurate written ideas from one language to another. And notice my emphasis on written. That's the main difference between a translator and an interpreter. If you will note the difference, interpreters will almost hug you for noting the difference. There is a big difference, so it's like almost the difference between a mechanical engineer versus an automobile mechanic. So it's they share the same kind of in the same area, but do things vastly differently. So here's what I think interpreters are. I think interpreters are in my mind, when I think of an interpreter, I think of an interpreter as an actor and as a catalyst of history. And I'll share a little more about that throughout the presentation today. Maybe at the end of the session today, I'll share a little bit more about why. But first, I'll like to share with you what interpreters do. Interpreters have three roles, really. They have three main roles. One of them is to communicate, or as interpreters, my main role as an interpreter is to make sure that you as a client can communicate with a third party in their target language. That's one of my roles. Another, and that's probably the main role that you will see an interpreter do. But another role of an interpreter is also to clarify. A lot of times some issues may come up where the speaker is not speaking adequately, or the interpreter didn't understand something, or the audience didn't understand what was translated or the information that was relayed. So it is an interpreter's duty to clarify the information that's being related. And this can be also through because of culture, which is the third role that interpreters do. They are uh, brokers, cultural brokers. This is a lesser known role, but it's probably for me one of the most key roles for interpreters, because a lot of times communication can really break down very quickly if there is an unknown cultural factor that may impact the development of the conversation. So there are several ways that interpreters can deliver their services. And there's more than three, but these are the top three that are being used at this time. There is in-person interpreting, which is the most common, most flexible, easy to use. That's where the interpreter actually goes to the location where he will be providing his interpretation services. There is video relay interpreting. That involves interpreting being off-site and using equipment to communicate with both parties involved. A little more complicated, but also very, very useful for quick access to language access. And then there's also over-the-phone interpreting, which is also very quick, a little more limited, but definitely very effective for immediate access to language interpreters. Now, modes of interpreting. This is a style, so to speak, for interpreters. And I want to pause here, by the way. If any of our audience does have any questions, just let Stacy know. And at any point during our session, you can definitely pitch in and let us know what your thoughts are, or share share your comments as well.
You are rocking it, Sam. But I have a question about, can you go back? I want to talk about video
Sure.
relay interpreting. Does that require special skills on the part of either the interpreter, or like what does that look like? Is like a conference call, or?
So with a video relay interpreting, it's basically the same structure that you would use with an in-person interpreter. The same ethics and same structure applies, but it is a little different in that it is a little more. You need a little more organization on the infrastructure side, because you do need equipment. You may want to make sure that that equipment is functioning beforehand, and probably you want to have an established agency or vendor that provides those services to you already. And that's pretty much, but the same principles of interpreting apply to the video relay, over the phone interpreting, and in-person interpreting. I guess there is differences between kind of the quality of service that you might want, that you receive from each one of these. Each service has its strength and its weakness, and I'll go over that a little more later on in the presentation. But suffice it to say that, for example, in-person interpreting is probably the best for when you have a lot of interaction with people, and you need a high quality of service. Video relay interpreting is probably the second best, because you can actually get a nonverbal feedback, and it's quicker to access interpreters that aren't readily available in your location. And over the phone interpreting is, although it doesn't provide the nonverbal feedback, it's still very useful in that you can still access interpreters very, very quickly. Within 30 seconds, you can have access to an interpreter in almost any language. So each form of delivery does have its strengths and weaknesses, but they are very useful nonetheless.
Awesome. Thank you very much. All right.
Sure. So I want to discuss more about modes of interpreting. There's two modes of interpreting. There's the simultaneous, and there's the consecutive. You think, well, how does this work? So let me explain a little bit. The simultaneous mode of interpreting, you've probably seen this happen before if you've gone to a larger meeting, like or if you've seen the United Nations presentations or speeches. Simultaneous interpreting is where the speaker, the presenter, is speaking continuously, nonstop as normal, and the interpreter is a little off-site, probably in a booth in the back of the room, as you see in the image here. And the interpreter is speaking or interpreting continuously without pausing what the presenter is conveying. This involves probably a team of 2 or more interpreters because as if the session goes on for over 2 hours, the interpreters need a little break here and there. So this mode of interpreting is probably best used when you as a client need to target large groups in a limited amount of time. It's best for using when you have a limited, you don't need a lot of interaction with your audience. And again, you have limited amount of time for conveying large amounts of information. That's simultaneous interpreting. Then there's also consecutive mode of interpreting, which is probably the most common. Consecutive interpreting is where the speaker relates ideas between 1 and 7 ideas, pauses, then the interpreter conveys those ideas to the listener, the audience, then the interpreter pauses, and the audience or the second party has an opportunity to convey their response, and then in that way the second party conveys their ideas to the interpreter again conveys the ideas to the main speaker. This mode of interpreting is probably best for interaction with smaller groups, which you can manage more easily, and where the session is highly interactive with the audience, and where you are conveying sensitive or highly impacting information to the target audience. So,
I have a question, Sam. Do you ever run into a situation where like the doctor or whoever is providing the information might speak a little bit of Spanish? Is there a way they can work directly with the patient who doesn't speak English?
So if, for example, there is a doctor that speaks a little English and wants to use his little English or little Spanish with the client, your question is what the interpreter would do in that case?
Right. Or are they even needed?
So as an interpreter, there's a code of ethics that you want to follow, obviously. One of the ethics is that, or standards of practice is that if you, as an interpreter, when present, have to interpret everything that's being mentioned within the room. But at that point, if the provider and the target audience, or in this case, the patient, agrees to not use the interpreter, then the interpreter will step aside. But unless one of the parties involved wants the interpreter present, then the interpreter will remain present and most likely ask the audience's cooperation to use the interpreter for the benefit of the audience.
Yeah, because I could see it being awkward in the event that, like, it's a sensitive condition, or, if there's something maybe, how does the patient know that the interpreter is representing them, but there's no like embarrassment, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so a lot of times the doctor may feel confident about his abilities to speak in the language, and as an interpreter, you always have to defer to your audience, to the speakers. So there has to be consensus. So a lot of times, what I do is that if the patient is uncomfortable with the situation, normally it's the stakes are high for the patient, and if the doctor feels comfortable with his language skills, I still ask that the doctor speak in his in English. I'm an interpreter for English Spanish, so if the doctor speaks English, even if the doctor knows Spanish, I ask that the doctor speak English so that the interpreter can interpret to Spanish. That way, the patient makes sure that he fully understands the implications of what's being related. Because patients get, they're scared, and they don't want to get confused about terminology or whatever, and they want to make sure that they're fully understanding what's gonna happen. So with having an interpreter, they make sure that they might understand most of what's being said, but that way they make sure it's just a double check. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that helps. I just, I can imagine it could get it takes a little bit of finesse on the interpreter's part to make everybody feel comfortable. And
yeah, definitely, it could get a little messy if you don't know how to manage the session. But again, if you stick to the interpreter basics, the interpreter sticks to his standards of practice and ethical rules. As an interpreter, my main goal is to make sure that both parties communicate well, and I definitely want to contribute to that. So I look for ways to make sure that that happens. So that's and it gets. But here's where I would do that before the session. There is these type of issues usually I like to prevent from happening, but usually all this happens before the session actually begins, and I'll explain that briefly now. So here's what you as a client would want to know before you begin working with an interpreter. So what should I do before the session begins? First, you want to plan. You definitely want to seek out an interpreter in advance. Interpreters are often very scarce, few and far apart, and depending on the service and specialty that you want, it may take a little time and effort to find the best interpreter for your needs. So you want to ask yourself, as a client, is your topic to be discussed very technical, have legal weight, or demanding high accuracy? If yes, you probably want to increase the amount of time that you want to invest in finding the right interpreter. So you also want to provide the interpreter, once you find one, with as much detailed information as possible. For example, if you have a presentation that's going to, where you're going to have government officials present, or you're going to have a large crowd present, and you're going to share statistics, if you have a speaker that's going to give a speech, if you have PowerPoint presentations, documents related to the interaction or the session, all this information usually you would have prepared beforehand. As interpreters, it is always useful to know as much as possible before the session begins. That way, the interpreter is more effective. And consider that if your session goes on for more than 2 hours, you'll probably want a team of 2 or more interpreters. So this is where a lot of clients maybe forget or skip this first step, which is actually very key for the interpreter. A lot of people say, "Oh man, interpreters know so much," and well, that's our duty. We have to know a lot. But also another key part of our preparation is planning before the session. And you will notice that a lot of interpreters have specialties, and that's to make sure that you as a client get the best service that you deserve in reality, and that way interpreters can be very effective. So if you as a client kind of plan out, if you are in a very specialized area like the medical field or the mechanical industrial field, you'll probably want to seek out an interpreter that's very knowledgeable in those areas. That way your session will be more successful. So plan out. What else can you do? Once you've scheduled an interpreter and you've found through an agency the interpreter that you need, you want to introduce yourself to the interpreter, state your role in the relationship in relation to the session, and make sure that you share any pertinent changes about the planned activities. Again, give a brief summary, if you have not done so already, of the goals that you wish to accomplish with the session. A lot of times this helps the interpreter create a big picture idea of what you want to accomplish during the session, and that way the interpreter knows what the session will involve. If you haven't done so already, please provide any available material to be covered in the session, especially if you're going to be reading anything. Reading speed is actually faster than spoken speed. So especially for a simultaneous interpreter, this is very important because the interpreter needs to speak very quickly, and if you're reading and speaking faster, it complicates things a little bit more. Also, you want to share any information or concerns that may impact the flow of communication. For example, in our previous example that we were sharing about a doctor speaking with a patient. If you, as a doctor, know that you are going to break pretty serious news, you want to make sure that the interpreter knows beforehand. That way, the interpreter is actually emotionally prepared to break that news. The last thing that you want is to have the interpreter break down and impact the flow of communication, and then you won't have a way to communicate with your client. So if there's any emotionally charged news or any news that may impact the flow of communication in any way, definitely share that with them before the session begins. That way the interpreter can take necessary measures and mental preparation for the session. Any questions till now? Okay.
No, I think that's good.
And actually, this is probably the one of the areas that I like to do most, and where I find most success when I do this, because this is where I, as an interpreter, kind of gauge what is going to happen during the session. I get a feel for the speaker, their style of speaking, if they have, and I weigh their personality, their demeanor, how they speak. That way I can convey as much as I can of their personality in their speech. And
so how does that, I have a question. So how does that work? I guess you said you speak, like maybe model that a little bit, like if you're speaking in the first person for someone, because is that a little bit awkward?
It definitely takes a little practice. It's for an interpreter, it's really weird to speak of yourself in the first person. So that's why I mentioned interpreters are are actors. So we have to I, as an interpreter, have to put myself in your shoes as the speaker. So if you're a very let's say, for example, you are a doctor again, and you are with mom and the child. And the child is a 7-year-old boy that has a toothache, for example. And the doctor says, "So, Mrs. Ramos, I see you have your 7-year-old child here, Juan. Uh, can you?" And she says, "Yes, doctor. My son has had a toothache for about a week." The interpreter would interpret what the doctor said. Let's see. Señora Ramos, veo que tiene su hijo Juan aquí. Then the interpreter would speak in first person what the mom just said, which was, "Yes, doctor, he's had this toothache for about a week." And if little Juan speaks up and says, "Sí, me duele el diente, la muela de atrás," I, as the interpreter, would say, "Yes, my back tooth hurts." Although it's not me that's hurting, I speak always on behalf of the client. So it is a little weird in that aspect, but you get comfortable with it, and it helps the interpreter to keep both parties involved, and so that way they can actually work with each other, and the interpreter kind of is a third party, almost like that little voice in the back of your head. That's kind of the way I like to think of it. So I want to be that unconscious voice behind you, instead of being that blaring microphone in front of you that's grabbing all your ideas and conveying them from one party to another.
Mm-hmm. It's a very giving act in a way. That's kind of neat.
It is. It's very fun. It's very enjoyable. And in that sense, you get to see firsthand what happens in the front lines of decision making activities, whether it be at a conference or at a governmental agency, a medical session, different types of things. So it's very, very engaging. And one of the things and to address your previous question about preventing that possible muddy interaction when a doctor speaks another the patient's target language. Usually, here is where I would address that during the pre-session interview. The pre-session interview is key to the success of the session. There are several points that the interpreter adheres to make sure that the session goes well. One of them is confidentiality, so all information related during the session obviously remains confidential. As I just mentioned, the interpreter speaks in first person. So when the interpreter says, "Oh, my tooth hurts," it's not the interpreter that's complaining, it's the patient. And the interpreter will do the same for you. When you are the speaker, he will speak on your behalf. So there's no need for you as the client to say, "Tell Mrs. Ramos this," or "Tell the gentleman that." You can say, "Sir, you this," and you can address the person directly. So do as well speak in first person. If the interpreter does need to speak up, there are certain occasions where the interpreter, for example, needs to go to the restroom. The interpreter will raise his hand to say, "The interpreter would like to ask for a recess," or something to that nature. And the interpreter will refer to him or herself as in the third person. That is a little funny, but that's to prevent any confusion during the session. And one of the things that is really helpful if you are the speaker is that when you're speaking and using an interpreter, refrain from using acronyms, idioms, technical jargon, shortened language that only you would know. So that way the interpreter knows exactly what you're referring to, and he or she can interpret it correctly. Flow. So this is probably where most interpreters might struggle a little bit, but you as a speaker can definitely help here, especially if it's this applies only for consecutive interpreting. You want to speak in short ideas, 1 to 7 ideas, and if the interpreter does have a question, needs a clarification, or would like to make a suggestion, he will raise his hand and let you know. There are a lot of times some certain type of information that you as a speaker think that is totally normal, but the interpreter as a cultural broker might say, "Hey, Mr. Speaker, you might want to say this a little differently because it might be culturally inappropriate to ask this question." You as the speaker then should ask for a suggestion and say, "How could I say this better?" The interpreter's role is then to suggest a better suggestion. In no way do you need to adhere to what the interpreter says. The interpreter is only there to suggest as a consultant, but not to demand that you do a certain thing. But in terms of preserving the communication, the interpreter's role is always to suggest the best approach to communicating. So the interpreter will definitely help you there. Where most people are unaware that the interpreter can really, really help you as a client. And a lot of times, there are very small nuances that you might be unaware of culturally that the interpreter is very aware of, and they can really, really help you have a successful interaction and positive future, stronger relationship with your clients. Again, one of the lesser known roles of the interpreter as a cultural broker, probably for me, the most important. So, and again, also accuracy and completeness. So any message related during the session, if it's in the room, within the room, the interpreter will convey that message accurately, reflecting both tone and register. I like to There's doctors. I work as a medical interpreter mainly. There's doctors that I've worked with for a couple of years, and I know their style. So as an interpreter, always looks to reflect the tone and style of a person. For example, if he says, "Hey, Mr. Thomas, how are you?" The interpreter in Spanish would basically say the same thing in style and tone. "Hey, Mr. Thomas, how are you?" It would be in Spanish. It would be, "Hola, señor Tomás, ¿cómo está?" So keeping that same intonation, the same tone, and also the same register. For example, if the doctor says, "Does your belly hurt?" In Spanish, the Spanish interpreter will also use the kind of that slang informal word for belly, panza. So we would look to use the same, conserve that same register. So, and I have a lot of fun doing that as well. One of the key things that I'd like to share with you briefly also is interpreter positioning. This is probably pretty unknown, or you probably don't think of it much as a client, but it's really important for the interpreter. There's two methods of setting up an interpreter. You always want to make sure that the interpreter is in a position where he doesn't bring attention to himself. That way he doesn't draw attention to him or herself, and promotes communication between you and the audience. So anywhere where these dots are under the square method is probably the best location for an interpreter. You never want an interpreter in the middle of both of you, if at all possible. That way you can have as much eye contact as possible. Or there's also the triangle method, where the speaker is a little off to the side, and you both can be facing each other and speaking. So if you have no questions, we will continue.
Yeah, that's cool. I never thought about that, the placement of where people are. So
Yeah, and this is mainly for consecutive interpreting. Obviously, with video interpreting and conference interpreting, it's a little different, but this is mainly for consecutive interpreting. Now, during the session, this is where the rubber meets the road. Again, just if you can adhere to what was mentioned in the pre-session interview, you should be fine. But just remember to speak to the person of interest, not to the interpreter. And remember to maintain eye contact with the subject as much as possible. Always allow the interpreter to complete his or her interpreting utterance before continuing, and refrain from having side conversations, either with the interpreter, with your fellow coworker, because that's, as an interpreter's role, it's the duty of the interpreter to convey everything that's being mentioned, so that puts the interpreter in a tight spot when you have side conversations. So if you are, for example, if you like to talk to yourself, the interpreter's duty is to interpret that too. So if you utter, "Oh man, my head hurts today," or "Oh man, I can't open this computer," the interpreter will interpret what you just said. So if there's something that you don't want your clients to know, please refrain from mentioning it. So this
is funny.
Yeah, it is a little funny, and but it definitely helps to conserve the kind of flow of communication, and also gains the confidence of the audience to know
What about taking notes? Can an interpreter kind of take notes? I mean,
oh yes,
it seems like it would require a lot of memory.
yeah, it does actually, and that's one of the reasons that we ask that speakers speak between 1 up to 7 ideas. Obviously, the more developed interpreters can maybe process more ideas, but yes, we do rely heavily on note taking, and they are bound by confidentiality. So any information again shared or written down on the notes is discarded at maximum within 24 hours, and oftentimes if you are more comfortable with, as a client, if you are more comfortable with the notes remaining within your facility, you can ask that the interpreter dispose of those within your facility appropriately. I, as an interpreter, usually dispose of these notes in a paper shredder at home within 24 hours. So yes, notes are key to my successful interpreting, but they are disposed appropriately. So, and the interpreter will take a lot of notes during your session, so he probably won't make a lot of eye contact with you as a client, and that's not your fault. It's not that the interpreter is trying to be dodgy in any way, but just the interpreter is looking to encourage you as a speaker to speak with your client, and also he or she is probably very focused on you taking your notes down. And do be aware that at any moment the interpreter may raise his hand and say, and suggest any clarification or any suggestion to preserve the flow of communication during the session. What else can you be? Just be yourself. I just reviewed a lot of things you might feel like you might be put in a box, but interpreters have a lot of fun. At least I do. Don't feel inhibited by all the rules and things that you have to adhere by. Just be yourself. Let your personality reflect through your speech. The interpreters will do their best to convey you as who you are. Just if you're crazy, be crazy. The interpreter will do the best he can to convey that to the speaker. And if there are times where I've been in sessions as a medical interpreter where I'm in a psychiatric ward and the patient speaks very strange ideas. The interpreter does his best to convey those very weird ideas back. And that's not the interpreter trying to make fun of the patient, but the interpreter's duty is to reflect style, register, and tone, as well as preserve a language structure as best possible. So, a lot of times if a speaker says a mistake, the interpreter will interpret that mistake as well. But if you like to be funny, be funny. The interpreter always likes to have a little fun in his interpretation as well, and it makes the session interesting too. And people really appreciate it, I've seen, if the interpreter has that ability to convey your personality through the interpreting session, and always have a lot of fun doing it. After the session, there's really not much to do. If you have any questions about the development of the session, you can ask the interpreter what you could have done differently, or if you believe you need the interpreter for a little longer than scheduled time, ask the interpreter if he or she can stay longer. Interpreters are a lot of times on a very tight schedule throughout the week, so ask if they can stay, and most of the time they are happy to help in any way possible, and if not, they can defer you to any other appropriate suggestions that can help you with your needs. And if they did a good job, absolutely let them know. If they didn't, also let them know. Definitely be very objective. A constructive review is always welcome. So again, in summary, what do I think interpreters are? I think they're actors. Why? Because their job is to grasp your ideas, not only what you're saying, but what you mean to say. A lot of times, if you are speaking very firmly, or you do a hand gesture and punch your hand on the table, and you say, "I need this done," the interpreter can convey that idea as well very firmly, so he can act on your behalf. They are also catalysts of history. Usually interpreters are present whenever decisions are made or information is relayed, information that will probably impact history, either personal or at a personal level or national level even, or an academic level as well, business, and depending on the area where they work. So in that way, interpreters do have a lot of fun seeing kind of having a first row seat of what's going to happen in the area that they are working in. And of course, I'm not biased here, but I think interpreters are awesome. So that's basically what you can do as a client to make sure that you will have a successful interpreting session. So if you have any questions or comments, you can ask now or leave a comment in the video below.
Thank you, Sam. And I will take this chance before we sign off for the day to let you know how to get in touch with us if you need an interpreter or if you have more questions about a specific situation that you were considering using an interpreter. You can find us on our website, which is mindlinkresources.com. And yeah, you could chat with us. There's a chat feature there. Just chat with us, and or definitely leave any comments here on this YouTube video. So yeah, and excited to hear more about, you know, people's experience working with interpreters, what works well, what doesn't work well. You know, that could be an opportunity for a future webinar. So great job, Sam. And
thank you.
With that, we will sign off. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thanks everyone for joining us.
All
Have a good
right.
one.
Bye.
Bye-bye.